Welcome! If you're a beginner sewer and ready to dive in but aren't sure where to start, then today's video is for you. Today, we're going to cover 4 basic stitches that every sewer should know, plus 1 bonus stitch that I find to be particularly amazing and use all the time. Plus, we'll cover some quick tips to get your machine threaded and ready to go. And stick around to the end because we're going to do a small little project together to give you some practice. Now, the first thing we're going to cover is how to thread your sewing machine. But before we dive into that, just a quick note about thread color. While there are no hard and fast rules about thread color, one good guideline is to pick a coordinating thread with your fabric or one that is slightly darker than the base color of your fabric if you don't have a perfect match. However, you can also pick something that contrasts with the fabric and adds a nice pop of color. I just want to let you off the hook that at the end of the day, you can choose whatever you want to choose. It's entirely a matter of creativity. But for today, I'll be using this super bright orange so that you can see the stitches that are being made on this piece of fabric. Now, to thread the machine, the first thing you're going to do is grab your thread spool and put it right here on the spool pin. This is a spool pin. Now, one tip when you're putting your thread on the spool pin is to keep in mind the end cap. With this thread spool, it just has a nice snappable cap that when you put it down means there are no rough edges that the thread could potentially get caught on. So it doesn't matter which direction you put it on the spool pin. With this thread spool, on the other hand, there's a little notch right here that's designed to hold the thread, as you can see right here. And with these kind of spools, you want to make sure that the notch goes towards the bottom of the thread spool so that the thread will not get caught on it when it is threaded this way. Alright, so you've got your spool of thread on your spool pin. Next, you're going to want to take a felt disc. This is just a very small circular piece of felt that goes right on top of the thread spool. Now, you're just going to want to lay it up there gently. It's not super tight. The next item is the spool pin cap. Now, you're gonna just want to put that right on the top there, right up to the felt disc, but it shouldn't be super tight. So let's take a closer look. So you don't want it to be like this. You want it to be a little bit loose so there's some space for the spool to spin. And this is just to keep it from flying off. Now, once you have your thread spool, the felt disc, and the thread spool cap on the machine, slide the spool pin down flat, take your thread and pull it in the direction of your thread guides. This first thread guide here on my machine, you just put it right in there. It's got a little bit of a clasp to it, and that helps with the tension. Next, you're just going to want to follow the guides on your sewing machine. On my machine, it tells me exactly how to thread my machine. So now that I've put it through this tension part, see the thread mark right here, so we're just gonna take that underneath that. Okay, before we finish threading the machine, we're going to thread and wind the bobbin. Now, if I were going to thread the machine, we did this step, and then I would continue to step 2 right here, which is taking the thread down this little track right here. Now, if you want to wind the bobbin, at least on my machine, there is a separate diagram right here that tells you how to do that. And this is the tension disc. It's kind of flexible. This is the tension disc for bobbin winding. Now, one thing you'll notice is the instruction on the picture partially matches the first step of threading the machine. So step 1 is the same for both threading the machine and winding the bobbin. So that step is complete. Second, we're going to wind the thread around the bobbin tension disc, which is this piece right here. Now, based on the instructions, we're going to take the thread through here, and then we're going to wind it around the disc, matching the picture. Next, we want to take our bobbin. Mine is a clear plastic bobbin. Now, to thread the bobbin, you're going to take this little hole at the top right there. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but there should be a little tiny hole in the top of your bobbin. You're just going to take your thread and put a little tiny piece through that. And then what I like to do is just press that down with your finger and then take the thread and wrap it around a little bit, enough to secure the thread on top and keep it from slipping out of the hole and unraveling while you're trying to wind the bobbin. Now, you're gonna wanna go ahead and wrap it around until there's no more loose thread. You're gonna wanna take that over here and just punch it down. First, you wanna make sure the machine is on. And then, as the little arrow shows, you just push that right on over there to trigger the winding process. Now I have a little extra thread here, and this is definitely something that we want to get rid of before we get started, but I have that on purpose because one thing I like to do is to condition my thread with thread magic as I run it through the bobbin winding. Now this just makes sure that it's nice and smooth and prevents it from getting knotted while it's in the machine. So now that I have my thread magic in here, I'm going to put that in place and then just tighten up the spool a little bit to take out that extra space. We want to make sure that it is nice and tight between the tension dial and the bobbin. Okay, so now that we have the thread magic in place and the thread is nice and tight from the bobbin tension dial to where the bobbin is, we're just about ready to go ahead and wind the bobbin. Now, the thread magic is not required, so if you don't have any, don't worry about it. It is kind of magical. It prevents the thread from getting caught in the bobbin area, which I actually tended to experience quite a lot. So if you're interested in getting that, I'll put a link in the description below. Now, if you notice on my machine, there's like a backward C and then a C looking symbol, and that's just my machine's indication that the bobbin is about to be wound. And so that all I have to do on my machine is go ahead and hit the pedal and then watch it wind. The bobbin takes care of everything itself. The winding process is totally automated. Now, if I wanted to fill up the entire bobbin, there is a bobbin stop right here, which means it will stop it from rotating once it gets full. I, however, do not want to fill up the bobbin because I'm not going to use that much orange thread and I don't want to waste it. And I also want this bobbin to be available for future use sooner than I would use the orange fabric. Once you've finished winding the bobbin or have as much thread on it as you need, you just slide it back into place and then you can take it off. Then after that, just cut off the end. You want to make sure there's a little thread left at the end because you're going to need that for threading the bobbin. Then I just take the thread magic off and we're ready to finish threading the machine. To finish threading the machine, we're going to pick up where we left off. Now you're going to want enough thread at the end in order to complete the threading process. Now we finished step 1 as indicated on our machine. Now we're going to go to step 2, which shows the arrow going down. So for my machine, I just put the thread right inside this cavity. Next, you're going to want to find step 3 on your machine. On my machine, this is basically like a U-turn symbol, and so just take the thread here and then run it back up this next cavity. The next step after that is step 4, which is again on my machine just another like U-turn shape. And so you take it and wrap it around, make sure that it gets hooked in this little metal piece, which it should do naturally if you follow the U-turn shape. Next, I'm just going to pull it down inside the rest of this cavity and get ready to thread the needle. Okay, now keep in mind as we finish this that your machine might not have all of the exact same features, but this should give you an idea of how to finish threading the machine. So now that the thread is down here, I'm just going to take it and wind it through, or I guess behind this little piece right there. You see that little piece? And so now the thread is tucked in here. Now I have an automatic needle threader, so to thread the needle, all I have to do is put it in through this little thing, and it does it for me. And then all I have to do is pull it out the other end. But if you don't have that, it's cool. You just do it the traditional way. And there you go. All done threading the machine. Now to thread the drop-in bobbin, you're just gonna wanna put it right in there and follow the instructions on the side. So I'm gonna loop it right through the first piece and then around the side, just like the picture shows, and pull the thread towards the back of the machine. Now while I have a hold of the thread, I'm gonna go ahead and put the bobbin case cover back on. Now I'm gonna leave the bobbin thread leaning towards the back of the machine. In order to catch the bobbin thread and wind it up through the machine, we're gonna wanna hold on to the top thread coming through the needle. And you wanna hold it pretty tight, just not pull the thread out. And while you're holding this thread, go ahead and wind the needle down. You're gonna wanna hand crank the wheel on the side of the machine towards you while you hold this thread tight, and then it'll pull the bobbin thread up through the machine just like you see here. Now I typically end up needing something to kind of help finish it, so I'll just kind of stick my scissors through here and go ahead and pull the rest of it out. Once that's done, you can push both threads towards the back of the machine again, and there you go. The top thread and the bobbin thread have now been threaded, for lack of a better word. Now unfortunately, if your machine has a front-loading bobbin, I don't know how to show you how to do one of those. First of all, my machine does not have a front-loading bobbin, and I've never used a machine with a front-loading bobbin, so I don't know how to thread that one, so I'm sorry. But I know that most modern machines today have a drop-in bobbin, so hopefully that helps you out. Now there are just a couple of things I want to cover before we dive into the stitches. And one of those is needle selection. You might be wondering what kind of needle you should use, and that's definitely a tricky one. There are lots of different needle sizes and different types, and it can be a little bit confusing. I myself don't have a complete grasp on all the instances where you would use one needle versus another. And one thing that I don't want to happen is for you to get overwhelmed by needle selection and fail to start sewing. It's not the end of the world if you choose the wrong needle. So here are just a couple of tips to give you some guidelines, and then otherwise just don't fret about it too much. So the main things to keep in mind when you're trying to select a needle is that there are different sizes and there are different point types. There are ones that are geared more towards cotton, there's ones that are for denim, and there's ones that are for knits. Knit needles are typically ballpoint, which is different at the end than the one I'm showing you right now, which you can probably hardly see. The standard size would probably be 90/14, and that's the one that I typically use the most often. The lower the number, the better it is for lighter fabrics, and the higher the needle number, the better it is for thicker fabrics. If your machine manual has guidelines for what size of needle to use, that's the best place to start. Another good rule of thumb is to just kind of test it with the fabric. So I've kind of noticed that if it's a really thick needle and the fabric is too thin, then it leaves a gaping hole in the fabric when I push the needle through it. And if the fabric is too thick and the needle is too small and I try to poke it through it, then it doesn't really go through very well. A lot of it is just trial and error, and while needle size can be extremely important, don't let it stop you from sewing. You don't have to have it all figured out before you begin. Now, as we cover our stitches, the first presser foot we're going to start out with is the general purpose foot, and that's what we're going to use for at least 4 of the 5 stitches we're going to cover today. So the first thing you're going to want to do to get started is put your presser foot on your machine if it's not there already. I've taken the general purpose foot, and since my machine has snap-on presser feet, I've just lowered the lever and it's going to pick it right up there. If your machine does not have snap-on presser feet, then you can change the presser foot just by unscrewing this screw here and then putting it back. Once that's done, you're going to want to take the bobbin thread and move it to the back of the machine again. And the top thread, this is not a huge deal, but just put it in through the little slot so that it's in the center of the presser foot, and put that towards the back of the machine as well. The first stitch we're going to get started with is a straight stitch. Now, to do a straight stitch, if you have an electronic machine, all you have to do is turn it on, and it should default to the straight stitch settings. If you have a mechanical machine, just go ahead and turn the dial to the setting that looks like a straight stitch. For a straight stitch, the automatic settings should be sufficient in most cases. Now, if you want to increase the length of each stitch, then you would just press this button. If you want to decrease it, press that button. Now the stitch width isn't really like a width between the stitch like a zigzag stitch would be, but rather the position of the needle. So in this case, it means this is the position of the needle to the left or the right. If I wanted the needle to move further to the left, I would push this button. If I wanted it to go further to the right, I would press this button. Now 9 times out of 10, I'm going to leave it exactly where it is and just adjust the seam allowance instead of moving the needle itself. To sew a straight stitch, go ahead and line up the edge of your fabric to the seam allowance. On my machine, I have this nice 1/2-inch seam allowance mark, in addition to other marks I could choose. But for now, let's just line up to the most obvious and visible mark. I'm going to leave the stitch settings where they are, and while gently holding the fabric to make sure that it doesn't move without pushing it or pulling it, I'm going to press the pedal down and just sew a standard straight stitch. Now the next stitch is a back stitch. A back stitch is essentially stitching backwards. It's when the direction of the needle / sewing is reversed. This is typically done to reinforce seams or the edge of a section of fabric that has just been run through the machine to secure the threads and prevent them from coming undone. So to sew a back stitch, you're first going to sew a straight stitch. I'm going to hit this reverse button right here, which used to be like a U shape, kind of like a U-turn, but has gotten worn from overuse. And so I'm going to hit that button while we sew, and it's going to sew backwards. Now, do it at the end. In order to adjust your stitch settings to sew a zigzag stitch, you'll just find the stitch that looks like a zigzag and read the code beneath it. On my machine, 03 is the setting for a zigzag stitch. So I just move this button until the screen shows 03. Now it's automatically selected a width and a stitch length. I can increase or decrease the position between the zigzag as much as I want. I can also increase or decrease the space between the zigzag. Most of the time, however, the automatic settings are sufficient. Now, if I want to get back to a basic straight stitch, I just move that button until it's back to 0. So a zigzag stitch, I'm just going to move in my fabric in a little bit more so that there's room to sew the zigzag stitch next to the existing stitch. I've already set my machine to the zigzag stitch and left it on the automatic settings. Now, if I want to adjust the width of the zigzag to make it wider, I can do that. And I'm going to make the length a little longer. See the difference? A basting stitch is a really long, straight stitch that is used for temporarily holding things together. It's meant to be removed. It is typically made of maximizing the stitch length to make it easy to remove once the final stitching is completed. This can be done either by machine or by hand. If done by machine, the stitch length should be set to the maximum length that the machine will allow. And now in order to set the stitch for a basting stitch, I would just increase the stitch length to the maximum that my machine will allow, which for my machine is 4.8, and that gives us a longer stitch. The stitch width is not necessary to adjust in this case, unless you're trying to move the position of the needle left or right. Now if I want to bring it back down, I would just put it back where it was. advantage of the overcasting presser foot and overedge stitch is that it allows you to closely mimic the way a serger finishes seams. Overedge stitches sew the seam and enclose the edge all in one step, similar to the way a serger works. As with the zigzag stitch, the overedge stitch and the overcasting presser foot can be used to pre-treat fabric to prevent fraying. It can also be used to finish seams while preventing fraying simultaneously. To use the overcasting presser foot and the overedge stitch, you just want to find the symbol for the overedge stitch on your machine. It looks like this. For mine, I have two options available, either 10 or 11, but I typically like to use 10 because that puts the straight edge further within the line of the fabric and only the edge of the triangle is looping over the edge. So to select this stitch, I only need to hit this button one time. Now, it is automatically set with a stitch width and a stitch length appropriate for the stitch. I don't typically tend to mess with the stitch length at all. I haven't found a reason to, but you can by either pressing this button to increase the length or this button to decrease the length. One reason to adjust these to either increase or decrease the distance from the line of thread to the edge of the fabric. If you want less distance between the stitch and the edge of the fabric, then you would simply select this button to narrow the width, which will move the needle further to the right. If you want to increase the distance between the thread and the edge of the fabric, then you'll hit this button to increase the width, which moves the needle further to the left. To reset the machine, just hit this button until it goes back to 0. To do the overedge stitch, we're going to need to change presser feet to the overedge foot. Since my machine has snap-on presser feet, I'm just going to snap that into place, put the fabric through the presser foot, and adjust my stitch settings to the overedge stitch. Now, to do the overedge stitch, you're going to want to line up the fabric right to the edge of this piece here. Not sure how well you can see it, but on this presser foot there is a little lip right here, and that's what you're going to be lining up the fabric to, as opposed to seam allowance. So to enclose this raw edge, I'm going to line the fabric right up to the edge of that lip and sew it with the automatic settings. Voila! The raw edge has been enclosed. You can also increase the stitch width and the length for a different effect. Alright, so I've set mine to the max that it will go, and let's look at the difference. See the difference? Just a couple tips as you're getting started sewing. One thing to always keep in mind is to keep your eyes focused on the seam and where the stitching is occurring instead of the needle itself. Now again, while not a requirement, I highly recommend that you invest in some thread magic. It strengthens the thread, eliminates static, and prevents tangling, which is the best part. Oh dear. My bobbin thread used to get tangled all the time, and I would constantly have like knots and it would get stuck in the machine, and I haven't had that problem once since I started using thread magic. So just to save yourself some headache, I would go ahead and get some. It's definitely worth the investment. And it, as you can see, I've only put 2 spots of thread marks in there, and I continue to use those, and there's plenty of it available, so there shouldn't be a need to purchase one for a really long time. So even though it seems quite pricey, it's a good investment, and you probably won't have to get another one for quite a while. Now, just to do a quick practice project, and what we're going to do is just make a little bookmark. Easy peasy. Now for this easy bookmark, you're going to want to make sure that you have a piece of fabric that is approximately 2 inches wide by 12 inches long. It's okay if it's a little shorter than 12 inches, as long as it's long enough to serve as a bookmark. If you have a scrap piece of fabric that's only 10 inches, I encourage you to use that. If you have 2 pieces of fabric instead of 1, that's also fine. As long as they're the same length, it'll work with that method as well. but I would recommend that it's at least 2 inches wide, because any narrower than that will be hard to turn inside out. Now once you have your strip of fabric, if it's not flat or has any wrinkles, go ahead and take it to the iron and press those out, and then come back. Now once you have your flat and freshly pressed piece of fabric, you're going to want to take the right sides of fabric, which is this pretty side, and put the two together. If you have one long strip, just fold it in half like this and make sure that all of the edges line up. If you have two pieces of fabric, do the same thing and just put the pretty sides together. So now you should be left with a single rectangle with the wrong side of the fabric facing out. Now if you want to know more about what the right side and wrong side of fabric is, then you may want to check the video linked in the corner. Now once you have your fabric together, go ahead and pin it so that it stays in place. Now I like to use these Wonder Clips because they're perfect for edges, and they're a lot easier to use, I think, than pins when you're dealing with edges of fabric. If you're interested in checking these out, I'll put a link in the description down below. Of course, pins are perfectly fine. Now I am going to use pins to mark a spot that I don't want to sew. So since this side of the fabric is already one piece, I'm going to mark the other short side of fabric a little bit from the edge as the place not to sew. This is a visual reminder for me as I sew around this edge not to sew this part closed. So if you're using Wonder Clips, go ahead and mark this edge with the pins. If you only have pins, find some way to mark this side so that you know that one side of the fabric you're not going to sew together. So once you have all of that marked, let's go to the machine and we're going to sew 3 of the 4 sides. Now I would normally use the overcasting presser foot, which is already in place, to sew down these 3 edges. But just to simplify it, I'm going to go ahead and switch back to my general purpose presser foot.
Let's say that 5 times fast.
Just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Now to get started, I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric right at the needle here and along the seam allowance. Now because this is a bookmark and it's only 2 inches wide, I don't want a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to adjust the setting on my stitches that moves the needle closer to the edge of the fabric. Next, I'll put the presser foot down and go ahead and sew down this first edge. Now when you get to this corner, go ahead and stick your needle using the hand wheel down into the fabric, lift up your presser foot, and go ahead and turn the fabric around with the needle still in the fabric. Then go ahead and pull your needle out with the hand wheel and resume sewing down this side. Now at this corner I'm going to do the same thing, put my needle down, go ahead and pivot the fabric around, and then sew down this last side. Now once I get to the end here, I'm just going to take out this pin because I don't want to risk the needle hitting the pin, and it's going to come right up at the edge here. But I'm still making sure not to sew this side closed. Now when you get to the end, you're going to want to enclose the edge of the stitching with the back stitch. On my machine, I have a button that looks like a U-turn that allows me to do that. So just press that and it goes back a few times, and I'm going to sew it right back out to the end. Cut it loose, and here we have a nice 3-sided rectangle sewn. Now the next step is to go ahead and cut off those extra pieces of thread at the end. Go ahead and cut them off and get them out of the way so that it's nice and clean for the next step. And because this fabric is particularly frayed, I'm also going to go ahead and shave off some of those edges. Now again, because of the fraying, this is why I would normally use a overcasting presser foot and an overedge stitch to enclose the raw edges. But since this is just a simple project and it's not going to undergo a lot of wear and tear, I wanted to make sure we kept it simple this time so we can all learn together. Now, once you've done that, you're going to turn the fabric inside out. Now because of this size, it's going to be a little bit tricky, but just keep at it until you get it. be careful while you're pulling that you don't pull so hard at the end here that you break the stitches. It's good to keep pushing it through with your thumb more than pulling it. Alright, now I've almost gotten it there, but notice the end looks a little funny. You're going to need to punch out the corners so that it is a rectangle again. I like to use this tool. I've forgotten what it's called, but it is helpful specifically for this purpose. You can kind of stick it in there, go ahead and use it to poke those corners out. If you're worried about poking through the fabric at all, you can also use the other end of it. I'm not particularly worried about it in this instance because I'm not going to be poking it that much, but that's certainly an option. Once you feel comfortable with the corners, you're going to take your rectangle back to the iron and press it down so that these edges lay nice and flat and are very crisp. Alright, so the first thing you're going to do is go ahead and press that down. Make sure it's nice and flat. I recommend pressing it on both sides just to make sure. Then you're going to want to take the unfinished edge of the fabric and just fold it down. It doesn't really matter how much. I'm doing maybe about 1 centimeter. You just want to make sure that it's inside enough so that it will stay. I'm going to go ahead and press down this first side here just to make it stay while I try to fold the other sides down. You want to make sure that you fold the other side down to match that along with the other two edges. Alright, so far I've gotten 3 down, so I'm just going to go ahead and press this to hold it in place because it's so tiny I don't want it to come undone. Now that I've got that, I'm just going to fold in this last side. It's a little bit trickier since it didn't quite stay closed. And I'm going to go ahead and fold it inside and press that whole thing down. Once all the sides have been pressed inside of the bookmark, I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in it. And I'm going to do the pin sideways this time just to make sure that the whole thing is enclosed really well and doesn't risk coming undone. Alright, so now that we've gotten everything pressed, we're going to start with the edge that needs to be enclosed. Go ahead and line that up right up to the edge of your needle. So you want your needle to be aligned almost perfectly with the edge of the fabric. Don't worry about a seam allowance marking because it's more important to make sure that you capture the very edge of the fabric in this case. So you're just going to have to keep an eye on where it is. And one tip to make sure that the stitching is straight is just keep an eye on where you're moving the fabric instead of the needle. And once you've got your fabric in place, go ahead and put your needle in using the hand needle. And you can go ahead and pull out your pin, but make sure to hold on to the end here so that it doesn't come undone. After that, you just slowly stitch down right along the edge. Now, since this edge has not been enclosed already, it's a good idea to just go ahead and do a back stitch here to reinforce the seam. Now, once that raw edge is enclosed, you can either go ahead and cut off these excess threads or you can wait till we're finished, whichever is easier for you. I'm going to leave them on here for now, and I'm going to go ahead and line up the next outer edge right up to the corner where we just finished sewing. Now I'm going to do the same thing that we did at the top all the way around all 3 sides remaining so that it keeps the fabric down and looks nice, neat, and finished. When you reach the end, do another back stitch to keep the stitches in place. Alright, now all of the stitching is complete. I'm going to cut off the excess threads and we'll be done. A lot of extra threads here. You want to make sure while you're snipping them not to actually snip any of the thread pieces that actually hold it together. Just get the edges Voila! There you go. You've now made your first project. Small little fabric bookmark. Good job! Now if you found today's video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more sewing tips, tricks, and beginner-friendly content. Now if you missed last week's video, which was all about sewing terms, I'll put a link right here so that you can catch up on all of those terms that you'll need to know for your sewing journey. And if you're interested in more beginner-friendly tips, then you may want to check out this playlist right here. Thank you so much. See you next time.